Hey everyone, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism Live. Today I have with me Massachusetts State Rep
Ciccolo.
Ciccolo. Oh, I totally got that wrong. Okay.
Okay.
Representative Michelle Ciccolo, who is my state representative in Massachusetts in the 15th district. So today I wanted to talk with you about what's going on nationally, how it relates to Massachusetts, what the legislature is doing, what we as citizens can do, and how we can all work to keep Massachusetts as free as possible. But first, can you tell me a little bit more about what you're working on and what you focus on, and then we can get into the conversation?
That's wonderful. Thank you for hosting, Stephanie. I'm glad to be here today. So this is my fourth term in the legislature. We have 2-year terms, so year 7 for me. And prior to that, I served locally on the select board for a term and a half, and on the planning board for 1 term. And my background was in municipal government and community development, having worked for a town in Metro West for 20 years and then running a small consulting firm that also supported municipalities and community development services. So that's who I am in a nutshell. And I think it's really true to say that legislators reflect their districts. And so their values and their priorities typically really are responsive to the needs of the residents that they serve. So when I headed to the legislature, I heard loud and clear from my communities. By the way, I'm the 15th Middlesex district, includes, prior to redistricting, it was all of Lexington and 2 wards in Woburn, which is like 4 precincts. But after redistricting, I'd lost 1 precinct in Lexington and picked up 1 precinct in Winchester. So I have 3 towns. But by and large, my towns really care, of course, about education. That is a top core value. But what I hear the most from my citizens about is the environment. So a lot of my issues that I work on are related to the environment and climate change, global warming, reduction of our carbon consumption. So when I came into the legislature, I founded the Zero Waste Caucus, which we didn't have a lot of people working in the waste arena as it relates to the environment. And we had parents in the district that were doing incredible things in our schools, establishing green teams and helping reduce trash in our schools, switching over to, getting rid of polystyrene and plastics in the cafeterias and setting up composting. So I wanted to sort of elevate those voices and bring some of those issues to the State House. So big part of my
some of those are
are they
a
yours
bunch
too?
of my friends are green team folks. Yeah.
Yes, it's wonderful. Love the green teams. They have so much energy. It's to me an incredible privilege to represent Lexington in particular, but my entire district, because the people in my district are so engaged. That's not the norm for, I have colleagues who they only hear from constituents when there's a problem, when there's a crisis, when it's a need for a constituent service. And I think we kind of believe in rolling up our sleeves here in this district and being a vibrant part of our democracy. So it's joyful for me to represent this district, but also an incredible responsibility because there's so much hope and energy and activism, and I want to bring all these great ideas up to the state level and amplify my constituents' voices. But it's daunting sometimes to keep up with the people in this community.
Well, I live here, and it's definitely an active community. Can we take a little bit of a detour from Lexington,
Of course.
into the State House as a whole, and into how national issues are affecting us here in Massachusetts, and what the State House is doing, what the governor's doing. So recently, just to update people who may not live here, ICE arrested an 18-year-old high school student.
Yep.
Who is still in custody. They just arrested about 1,500 people, mostly in Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket, where they count on tourism a great deal. And the feds are in a massive battle with Harvard
Yep.
which I think probably almost everybody knows about, but it hits us particularly hard here because Harvard employs so many people. There are so many Harvard hospitals and research centers, and it's rolling over to other universities. So I saw today that Clark University in Worcester cut 30% of their programs.
Yep.
WPI, Worcester Polytech, has just laid off 24 people. So it's a rolling challenge in higher ed. So what's up in the state house, or how do you guys think about it? What can Massachusetts do? What's your thought?
These are very bleak and troubling times. There's no question about it. And we are bracing for enormous impacts to the state budget. And we are seeing the consequences of the cuts in all the federal funds. And there's no question it's a challenge. And you'll hear the governor say, we can't possibly replace all of the lost federal funds. We don't have the resources, and it's not something that we could take on without massive tax increases, which I think nobody wants. That's a goal of her administration, and a goal of, I would say, the both branches in the legislature, is to continue to move Massachusetts to a more affordable place, right? It's a high cost of living state. So adding more burden on people is not something that we're too enthusiastic about at the moment. And we are deeply troubled by what's going on with ICE. And, I sit on the Public Safety Committee, and there are a number of bills that you've heard of. I'm sure the Safe Communities Act is the common name of one of the bills in particular that limits the scope of what our police force at the state level and at municipal levels can do in terms of supporting ICE. So there are various contracts that that exist or have existed in the past to deputize police officers or state police folks to assist in detaining and holding. Like some of the Plymouth sheriff has a detention facility and a contract with with the federal government to allow for some people to be detained there. And so the bills that we're looking at in the legislature that are trying to address this essentially eliminate future contracts with ICE and eliminate the deputizing of our police force. That's different than saying we won't cooperate with ICE, because we can and do and always should cooperate with any federal law enforcement agency when they are pursuing a criminal, right? It is good practice. We all want to see crime removed from our communities, but we don't ever want to see overreach and overstepping and what appears to many people to be lawlessness. Unfortunately, and there's been some good information put out by the Attorney General's office recently, the Homeland Security Act that was passed after 9/11 gave broad-reaching authority to the federal government and to the executive branch in matters of immigration and detention and removal of folks from this country. So at the moment, they are, Washington is taking the position that what they are doing is completely lawful. Those of us that are watching this feel there's a breach in due process that is, we believe, a constitutional right that's not happening. And
you believe, I mean, it's in the First Amendment and it's in the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, it is.
Oh, it's not in the First Amendment.
Yes, it is.
It's all over the place. 14th Amendment.
That's right. But it's a gray area in terms of, they're coming with administrative warrants, and those were allowed through the Homeland Security Act instead of judicial warrants. And so it's very difficult for our police to intervene. And right now, the best advice for local police is that they observe and keep the peace and make sure nobody gets hurt, but don't intervene. Because that would set off another set of challenges and conflicts. So what else are we doing? We're looking at legislation at the state level. We're supporting our immigrant communities with funding in terms of for legal services. That's something that we've been systematically increasing in recent years so that immigrants have some access to resources, experts that can help them navigate these various administrative and judicial warrants and procedures that might be seeking to extradite them out of this country. The hard part is that the rules have been changing day to day in Washington, and it's a very unfair situation where people who are here were here legally with the federal government authority to be here for asylum purposes or various different categories of visas that they came in with, and all of a sudden overnight they're being canceled, which is senseless, without any process for, you could change your views on what's right federally. Washington has clearly gone in a different direction than what the blue states want to see, but you don't have to do it in a capricious way that is disruptive and harmful and inhumane, right? You could say we're going to slow down the number of new visas. You could say that these visas will expire in 6 months or a year and a half, and people not need to make plans now to begin finishing up their education or their coursework, and because your visa won't be renewed but to do it overnight with no notice is disruptive to the economy. It's unfair to human beings in a way that is profound, right? It's distasteful. It's very un-American, right? We really, it's not a country that I recognize, and I think it's horrible. And it's very tricky to know. We have almost no authority at the state level to impact any of that. That all has to be reined in by Congress. And so as a state, we are mostly worrying about supporting the immigrant communities that need our help today, supporting them, as I said, with the legal resources. But then, as you also brought in the question about what's going on with the higher ed and the canceling of all these federal grants and research grants, that's a crisis for Massachusetts. But I would argue it's an even bigger crisis for humanity. So much of the research work that was being done is drug discovery, medical discovery, attacking disease and helping keep human beings healthier. And when you cancel medical trials in the middle that have been ongoing in some cases for 10, 15 years, the research gets completely invalidated if it can't continue on its track. And you have to start over. The loss of resources and information that has been developed through those grants is catastrophic. And many of the grants relate to our, national defense in some cases. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly going to make Americans much less safe from a national defense perspective, but also from like an infectious disease perspective, right? So what do we do in the state? I've been working with the governor's office and colleagues to try to come up with some innovative ways to think outside the box, to pull together some public-private partnerships, to potentially look at some tax credits that we could make available now that would not become due for a number of years, to look at trying to bring in traditional banking and venture capital and philanthropy all together at one table, to recognize that when we invest in Massachusetts in the projects that were keeping us strong, it really bolsters our economy, and it would help us better position ourselves for the future. So the cuts are happening around the country too. It's not just Harvard, but obviously Harvard is one of the hardest hit universities.
But it's also one of the only that could actually fight it,
right?
Which is their resources.
That's right. And I'm very proud that they've been pushing back. I mean, it's, I am enormously proud of what Massachusetts is doing. But to give you another example of the kinds of things that we're doing, yesterday I was at an event with the Consul General from Canada, and the Lieutenant Governor was there, and we were talking about pulling together the New England states to work more closely with Canada because
good.
There are our largest trading partner is Canada,
Right.
and particularly in New England and Massachusetts. It's Canada before China and Mexico, and it's really an important part of our economy. And so, if we work multiple states together, we can try to blunt some of the negative impact that will happen to New England, that the federal government is unleashing. And I think we have a tendency to, in tough times, dig in deeper and strengthen our bonds and build our communities even tighter, because we're strategic here in this state, right? And so I was very hopeful coming out of that meeting yesterday that we would figure out how to preserve the high quality of life we have here, how to pivot and adjust to things that may be disruptive but could help us think outside the box. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of talk right now, with all these various federal agencies being gutted. There's a lot of rethinking, about do we need that, or is there a different way to deliver that same service, and can we do it even more efficiently? And there's some conversation around what has made the rest of the country so disillusioned with government, that I think is an important conversation for us to be having. And one of the themes that's coming up again and again is that people felt the government wasn't responsive. It was taking too long to do things, and we had sort of lost our mojo in terms of our efficacy to build infrastructure. And if we want to solve these major projects, we got to get back to building things again and building, the infrastructure that is the base for a healthy economy. And so we're talking about at the state level, streamlining various types of permits. I was just invited into a conversation with folks at MassDOT to talk about streamlining the environmental permitting, for road and transit projects, so that we can deliver those faster and more efficiently and more cost effectively. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's a huge boon. And last session, one of the House priorities was the energy, siting and permitting bill. It sounds a little esoteric, but we're trying to convert to all clean energy. And it's not easy to do that if the permitting process is too murky. So we streamlined and accelerated the permitting process to make it more efficient so that we could build more renewable energy in the state. Because we know we're going to need a lot more electricity, if we are going to continue to convert our houses and our cars over to electric, and with AI needing tremendous electricity mm-hmm. resources, we've got to build our capacity, and we have to be able to do that rapidly. So we're focusing.
Don't we get most of our energy from Canada at this point?
Yep. And that's one of the reasons why the tariffs are really bad. But that's right. And so, but it's not just where we get the energy from. I'm talking about transmission lines and generators and battery storage and solar and wind, all those things that we cite in Massachusetts. Does the physical infrastructure that has to get located in the state. We need to accelerate the permitting process. And so we did that last session. And, press doesn't write about these things that often, right? But it's
kind of boring.
It's in response to a very clear recognition that government people want their government to be more effective and to deliver at a faster pace, so we can see the changes that we want to see. So those are the things that I think that is the bread and butter of the work we do. You don't hear about it much in the press, but those are the things that will keep Massachusetts stronger than ever, even though the federal government is unraveling itself. Right?
Yeah. Well, it's great to hear all of that. I've been thinking for a long time that we needed to be, having closer relationships with Canada, given all this around and Canada's new, stance about the United States.
Yeah.
One other thing that I'm really super concerned about is public health.
Yes.
And we here have been very strong on public health. Can the state, given the fact that the pandemic playbook has been tossed and that the HHS nut job is trying to take away vaccines. Is there anything the state, let me ask this a different way. Can the state make up enough? Because I know the state does a lot of public health work, make up for what the federal government is taking away?
That's yet to be seen. We're the huge bill that's working its way through Washington right now.
I call that
Trump's
the
gone.
MAGA murder budget.
Yeah. Um, that bill, we don't know yet how deep the cuts will be to Medicaid, and for that matter, even to Medicare, as they streamline the administration of it and make it harder to access your services that you're entitled to. Closing offices and laying off people that administer the program. I suspect that in offices like mine, we'll get a lot more constituents writing to say we just can't access our benefits. Can you help us? And it's a tricky thing because we primarily focus on helping people access state government resources. And, if we have to kick them up to their congressional rep, there's so many more people and so many fewer of them to help unlock some of those access points. And we'll do what we can where the intake is Massachusetts based to help them. But you're talking more specifically about the lost resources. And I don't know. I don't know yet until we see how deep the cuts are, what we'll be able to do here in Massachusetts. We already had a number of hospitals on shaky ground, especially our for-profit hospitals. We've already been going through some consolidation. I think there's going to continue to be a shakeup and a real reexamining of how to deliver health services in a more cost-effective way. We had prescription drug legislation that we worked on last session, and we're continuing to look at the rules that it's pretty esoteric that oversee how the different parts of the system are paid, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reimbursement rates and trying to pivot to focus more on health outcomes and less on, prioritizing all these expensive tests that don't necessarily keep people healthier.
Mm-hmm.
One of the problems is we don't invest enough in primary care in anywhere in our health system in the U.S.
Yeah.
And there's, because of that, very few doctors going into primary care. I've met with a number of doctors from the primary care field this session. I'm on the public health committee as well. And tomorrow we're hearing the vaccine bills, for instance. It's really never dull, but the primary care issue in particular is one that we really need to direct some attention to, because it's quite possible that supporting more primary care will keep people healthier, which will keep our healthcare costs down, which will help blunt the impact of the federal cuts, right? It's a virtuous circle, and we have to really say, this is where we need to invest our money right now because we don't have unlimited resources.
That's a lot. And a lot of our, at least city hospitals, are affiliated with universities, which, kind of multiplies the impact. So I'm curious about whether your office in particular, or the state government is in contact with our federal reps. I mean, ours is Catherine Clark, and she's the whip. How are you guys working together or not to try to help Massachusetts?
So we definitely work in alignment with our congressional delegation. And there's different ways we do that. We get a lot of briefings from the staff when there's new federal legislation that impacts us or changes in federal rules. We are constantly being invited to attend webinars and seminars that are being put on either directly by our U.S. senators or our congressional reps. but also receiving materials from staff. And, we know them directly. We can call them when we need to. They are very responsive to us and the needs of Massachusetts. I would say, though, with respect to right now, with the Democrats not being in control, there's a limited amount of things that our congressional delegation can do to influence the outcome of legislation, right? So the focus right now is less on modifying bills as they're working their way through the process, and more on trying to, encourage them to stop the bill if they can, if it's one that we see as very detrimental, or working with encouraging them to work with other states to where there may be more influence. It hasn't been like this in a long time, where one party held all the cards, right? And so
Right.
in Massachusetts, I would say we're more focusing on using the Attorney General's office and the court system to stop bad decisions. And it's coming through the private sector as they're impacted, or, in the case of Harvard, they're suing, there's a countersuit. And Andrea Campbell, our Attorney General, has been wonderful at pushing back on any number of policies that are really bad for Massachusetts. And she's really terrific at what she does. It's been very heartwarming to see the effect of some of the legislation and some of the lawsuits that she's signed on to, either because she's initiating them or working with other AGs from other states. So right now, that's where the sort of collaboration is, where we have some power left still to impact things. In a normal time, when Congress is more mixed, or where the House is Democratic, or, we have more ability to influence legislation through our leaders, right? So right now, that's not the focus. The focus is on some of the protesting and the standing out against rights that we feel are under attack. The group in Lexington, for instance, the No Kings, No Tyranny group, has been so inspiring, and love their signage and, respecting the rule of law. That is catching on, and people need to know that it only takes 3.5% of the population to peacefully protest to bring about regime change, to really bring about material significant change. There's a study from Harvard and I want to say Oxford, I forget, but look it up. It's the 3.5% rule. And that gives me a lot of hope as we in Lexington export the message that we had developed very organically, about respecting the rule of law. And in America, democracy is king. And that's where we have to lean into right now, are those messages that can be nonpartisan.
Right.
I talked to plenty of Republicans, and they are not happy with what ICE is doing. They're not happy with the capricious cuts all over the place, the disruption, the back and forth. I don't think many of the Republicans that I talk to feel that what Trump is doing in Washington is at all advantageous for the United States.
I'm glad that you talked about that. That's where I was going to go next. So in Lexington, we have this group called Lexington Alarm, which kind of harkens back to the alarm system to alert the Minutemen that the British regulars were coming. And they produced all these signs that are catching on everywhere, saying no kings, and there's a Patrick Henry quote, and about the rule of law in kind of old style print. And I know that you're connected in some ways with that group, as am I. You touched on this a little bit already, but how much do you think this kind of approach here in Massachusetts is getting exported are people around the country, like interested in the way that, we've approached it from a kind of very American history kind of way? Did Patriots Day influence that at all? And for those of you not in Massachusetts, that's the commemoration of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. But we had lots of dignitaries, and we do a um, what do you call it, reenactment every year. But this was a special one. So, do you think that because some of those seminal events happened here, that we have any influence over the way, the larger community, country is doing or seeing things?
I would say yes, but so the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution is something that we are enormously proud of and have really leaned into the celebration, because the very first shots, the very first deaths in the American Revolution occurred on our battle green.
Right.
And people there stood up for their right to self-governance. That was their priority. Yes, they were unhappy about taxes, but the biggest reason was the king disbanded town meeting and disbanded their ability to assemble in what was the precursor to the Massachusetts legislature. So when he did that, people felt it was outrageous and they pushed back. And I find that incredibly exciting, because it's a reminder that we cherish our ability to make decisions collectively and through a process that is democratic. So the "No Kings, No Tyranny" signs that you're talking about, and the in America, the "Law is King," those two posters that appeared all over town, popped up so organically. There were thousands out overnight because they resonated, and we had visitors from all over the world that weekend, over a period of actually close to almost 6 or 7 days. And people were relearning their American history, and they were understanding at a deeper level what it means to be American and what people fought for in the creation of this country. And a lot of people who saw those signs asked to take them with them. They went down to DC, they went out to Connecticut. People, they wanted copies of the signs, and we are getting requests to have those signs shipped. Shouldn't say we, I'm not part of the organizing committee of the Lexington Alarm Group, but you can go online and go to lexingtonalarm.org, and people are ordering signs from around the country. Whether or not everybody will understand what those signs mean and why they were created is a question. And I think I've been urging the Lexington Alarm Group to keep it nonpartisan, to keep it focused on our basic human rights and our constitutional rights. Because what I hear from a lot of people is they're just so tired of the extremes on the left and the right. They're just as unhappy. People in my own family, they don't want to listen to politics. They feel it's so polarized. There's no actual meeting in the middle and communication among different viewpoints. And I think it's true that we have lost a lot of our discourse and dialogue, and that's where we need to get back to. And so I hope as those signs spread, the part of the message that we're spreading is about self-governance, is about
Right.
the need to bring everybody together to one common table, to hash out a problem, to come up with a solution. Because Americans are brilliant. We have resources. We attract the best and the brightest all over the world. We have incredible educational systems, and people came here to create a better life. And our people who come here, whether you're an immigrant or whether you were born here, are very invested in continuing to make this an even better nation. And when people feel they have no agency and they have no voice, that's when they get angry and disillusioned with their government. And so we have to reassure people that they do indeed have a voice. And unfortunately, with social media and misinformation, the clickbait that occurs from the extreme messaging is what gets people's attention. And the vast majority of casual observers who don't live and breathe government like someone like I do, just hear noise.
Right.
cacophony, and they don't actually see, like, what I was talking to you about, the stuff that'll make your eyes roll back and you'll fall asleep. The energy siting bill legislation that we did, that's pretty esoteric, and
Right.
not, but, and so the press doesn't write about it because it doesn't get a lot of clicks. So
Right.
they don't see that, at least in Massachusetts, government is really working very effectively. And we work across the aisle with Republicans, but also across the aisle with the Senate, which is its own branch of government, and the executive branch, which is its own. The Senate's not its own branch; it's its own section of the legislature. But we work pretty collaboratively, and get good policy moving forward. And it works the best when your average citizen really engage. So
Right.
voting, but also I tell people not to get discouraged that they can't change things in the federal government, but to engage locally and
Right.
get other people they know to actually. And this is what we need all over the country. Our institutions have broken down. Our local organizations, we need to rebuild those, where people can
Right.
come together and solve common problems in their own communities, in their counties, so that they feel like they're heard and that their needs are being taken care of. And let the state and federal stuff be sort of somebody else's problem. Yes, give input, but you can give input through the groups that you engage with, to
Right.
help make better policy. And you don't have to take on Washington. You can just take on, I was thinking recently that when yesterday we were hearing from the panels. We had Mayor Wu and Lieutenant Governor on the panel as well, and they were talking about how bad the tariffs have been for the plumbers. Like it's super expensive now for small business owners who are, in the plumbing field, because the metals that are used in plumbing have got huge tariffs on them, 25% or higher, and so that's driving their costs up, and it's making it really difficult for them to get customers and to do the work without absorbing a loss. And I thought to myself, well, I'm sure there's a statewide plumbing organization. And if that statewide plumbing organization wrote to folks in Washington as an organization, or worked directly with their counterparts in other states to say these tariffs are bad for us, those are the kinds of voices we need to hear.
Right.
Associations and organizations that you might be involved in locally that have access to a bigger voice,
Right.
at the state and federal level. That's how you make change. So, as an individual, you don't need to feel overwhelmed. You don't need to feel hopeless. You just need to engage in whatever you know the best. We had the dentist into the State House yesterday. If you're a dentist and you're an expert about dentistry, well, we want to hear your voice. Work with your organization and let them collectively amplify the needs of your group so we understand it better at the state level. And similarly, if you're, you know, whatever career you're in, if you're a car mechanic and you
Mm-hmm.
know about the costs associated with the parts, tariffs on all the auto parts, engage in the Mass State Auto Dealers Association, or Mass State. There's many different associations. Engage with the ones that you know and work with them.
That's that's great advice, and that's the advice that almost everyone who's involved or has been involved in deep change has made, is keep it local.
Yep.
Um, the one thing that I would like to add is that while we keep things nonpartisan, is we have to be really careful to keep our values,
Yep.
right? And not, because most Americans share our values.
Yep. That's right.
So like as we try to connect with people wherever they are, we should keep what we know to be important and true,
Absolutely.
because very likely we've got common ground there.
That's right. Nobody wants to see their neighbors deported. Nobody wants to see the family and the children that they know from their children's schools ripped out of the community. And yet, a lot of people would say, well, we have to stop this immigration crisis, right? They don't equate that these are real people in that have real relationships and have jobs and are working in our community. But we probably can all agree that we need to reform the system and improve the way we've been doing immigration because it's not working. And there are some states getting overwhelmed with the
Hmm.
sheer number of new people that they're having trouble absorbing, finding enough housing for them, finding, other states desperate for workers. They have not enough workers. But it is also true that the illegal labor has been depressing low skilled wages, right? So we have Americans who are citizens having their labor rates depressed because illegal labor is undercutting them. And it's not been an easy thing to talk about. We don't want to talk about that because we want to embrace our immigrant neighbors and support them and give them the same on ramp that many of our ancestors had.
Right.
We want, I mean, that's what made this country so, so strong. And we have a declining native born population. We will be in a crisis as a nation if we don't welcome immigrants and have population growth. We won't be able to support the people who are here as they age with enough services and wages and um, businesses operating just for the people that are here. You need a certain amount of growth is healthy, but it's how we go about doing that, right? And these are hard conversations. There are many cases where immigrant illegal labor is being exploited to the point where many of them are almost indentured servants because they can't say anything
Yes.
without getting
Yes.
deported or getting in trouble. And that's also not acceptable. And, we, to a certain degree, profit off of um, costs being kept low, right? Nobody
Hmm.
wants to go to their favorite restaurant and have the costs go up. But if the people in the kitchen are all illegal, the cooks are being, paid under the table, it's going to keep our dinner plate price lower. And we have to sort of look these tough issues square in the face and say, no, we want legal immigration procedures so that these people who come here have a better life and have a better chance of establishing themselves, getting the education and the upward mobility that they're here for, starting businesses. I mean, so many of our small businesses are started by immigrants. We can't lose that uniquely American um, feature of our society where we attract people from all over the world and we get the best, the brightest, and the hardest workers. We want that, but we don't want indentured servants, and we
Right.
don't want American workers' wages depressed. So let's give very clear legal pathways to our immigrants. Let's help them. Let's sponsor them. But then let's also punish bad actors. Let's punish the businesses that are doing things that are illegal. And let's
Right.
actually crack down on that, but let's have a sane and thoughtful immigration policy that that supports everyone. We want our
Hmm.
businesses to do well. We want um, our immigrants to do well, and we want costs to be reasonable. But the system today is broken, and we have to talk about that. It's a really hard issue to talk about, and it's time to use this crisis that we're in to be willing to have these hard conversations.
Absolutely. And to have the conversations from, as you were saying, the point of view of, so I in my other part of my life do leadership coaching and classes for higher ed staff, and we talk about humaning better, right? All leadership, but also citizenship is about bringing your best self
Yeah.
to any conversation, and just humaning better. And I think sometimes we get caught in the trap. The pro-democracy side gets caught in the trap of speaking in the language of the anti-immigrants, and forgetting how important immigration is and immigrants are to our community, and celebrating that.
Yes,
But
celebrated.
you're absolutely right. Like, we don't want indentured servants, slaves. I mean, the whole thing is screwed up and intertwined with all sorts of other
Other
issues.
economic issues, our
Hmm.
food policy in this country is so upside down. Big ag, routinely takes advantage of cheap migrant labor, which helps deliver cheap food to our table. But the food is, sprayed with all kinds of pesticides and trucked all over the place. And we need to learn to localize our food a little bit more, actually have more local resources. And we need to figure out how to invest in different systems that deliver fair wages. And these are hard questions. And for better or for worse, the tariffs are going to make everything more expensive, dramatically more expensive. And perhaps the next administration and the next Congress can look, instead of using tariffs to penalize everyone, let's use some of these economic levers to adjust the system to a more fair system, right? So,
Right.
if all of our food goes up by 25% because of the tariffs, well, maybe the next presidential administration can bring that cost of the food increase way, way down, but also leave enough of a cushion to pay fair wages
Right.
and to support our farmers in this country. I mean, they have an enormously difficult job. My side gig, I have a big garden. It's one of my hobbies, and it is so hard to grow food. I do not know how we don't all starve. It is really, we
Mhm.
have to give them credit. They're trying to produce high volumes of food to feed everyone. And we need to, instead of penalizing them, we need to find ways to support them to transition their practices to ones that are more regenerative and better for the environment, better for our public health, and also pay fairer wages for them. I mean, the farmers take an enormous risk, and they have seasons where whole crops fail, and nobody worries about them. Instead, we shrug and say, "Well, what do you mean I can't get my cherries this month?" Or
Right.
we the wealthy states just expect the food's going to arrive from all over the world and they'll have anything they want. Well, maybe we have to be willing to pay a little bit more for things that are grown in a more environmentally friendly way, and maybe um, we need to adjust our habits to enable a fairer, better system.
One I listened to a podcast with um, Eva Longoria a couple of years ago, and uh, they were talking about. I mean, uh, she's was living in where in Texas when it was Mexico. So it's like, and one of the things that she said that has hit me so hard is that those of us who can afford to buy organic food, it's not just about the pesticides in the food, it's that by spraying pesticides on large crops, you're also spraying the farm workers themselves
Yes,
with poison.
yes.
And that's one of the things that really touched me, because who thinks about the
The
farm
work,
workers when you're having a conversation about organic vegetables?
right. And we
Um,
wonder why our healthcare costs so much in this country. We do so many things that make our people sick and unhealthy
yeah, we
and
do.
expose them to so many chemicals. And that's got to stop because, first of all, we don't want any human being impacted in such a horrific way. But second of all, we can't afford the medical bills. Like,
Right.
all of our health insurance goes up. Medicaid and Medicare and market-based health insurance is influenced by the level of sickness in society. And you know, I, I also focus a lot on public health, and I have some obscure bills. One of my bills is, the green landscaping bill to provide a ramp for people to convert from gas to electric, and that was also inspired by the local action in my district. One of the reasons I sponsored that bill is because two-stroke motors are very toxic for the workers inhaling the fumes, and it
Mhm.
and they ruin their hearing. So not only are they, you know, they're getting asthma and cancers because of what they're inhaling, but then they're also losing their hearing, and that's a huge problem for the human beings that run this equipment.
Right. But many of them have a
Are
hard
illegal
time
workers.
affording. the electric piece, the electric, whatever, leaf blowers that are, you know, far more expensive and not as efficient. I mean, they're efficient
They're getting
energetically,
close.
but
They're getting better. I've been to demonstrations that show that the electric are better than the gas now in some cases and have no maintenance. I've had some, I've I've done some visits with various manufacturers and seen the demos. And yes, it's a bit of a learning curve. They do cost more money. That's why my bill focuses on giving grants to the small businesses and loans, both low interest loans if you don't trade in a piece of equipment, and an outright grant if you trade a piece of equipment. And that's the goal of the legislation, to so that the small businesses aren't hurt, right? But they want to make this. They would be willing to make the transition if it was cost effective for them to do so, because they do recognize it's better for them as well. And so it's just figuring out where that sweet spot is between providing enough incentives to spur the market to produce these machinery better and faster and more cost effectively, versus being punitive and saying, there's a mandate that you have to switch by a certain date. And you got to kind of provide the carrots and the incentives before you provide the stick. And that's what we do in government. It's a long, slow process. We can't make the changes overnight, but we try to balance all of the competing needs by hearing everyone and moving forward incrementally and deliberately in a thoughtful way.
So as we wrap this up, is there anything you want to say that you haven't said to the people who are hopefully listening, because hopefully this worked technologically, or ask me anything? So is there anything in any direction that you want to add?
Well, we've had such a far-reaching conversation. I think I think I want to tell people not to give up hope and try not to get disillusioned. We're at a unique inflection point in society where there's been rapid change in so many different areas. It's causing a lot of the unrest, the way we communicate, the internet, the access to an incredible amount of information, but also misinformation. In times historically when society has changed the way it communicates, there's been periods of unrest immediately afterwards, right? This is a cycle that happens when people adjust to the new way of communicating. But we've also had big changes in the nature of the household. Women didn't used to work as much. And as a woman who has worked my entire career, I felt the impacts of what that's done to the family. I always joke that in my house, a big night out on Saturday night was going to Wegmans, where we could all choose our dinner off the hot bar because we had no food at home. Because I was working all week and it was time to do the grocery shopping. So instead of, having a potluck with the neighbors, there's less opportunity for casual socialization when you're just trying to get the family's needs met. And we have to remember that we're going to have to develop more family-friendly policies, because men are also feeling the brunt of, working, but then also having to do more at home to support their spouse that's working. And these are changes we haven't really contemplated about the impact to the American family and to children as they develop. Do they have as many adult mentors as they used to have? Do they go to as many, the engagement in religious organizations has fallen off dramatically because families don't have the bandwidth to work all week and then also go to, church or synagogue or mosque or whatever it is whatever religion you are engaged in. There's less of that on the weekends because we're stretched so thin. And that has implications for the breakdown of the fabric of our society. And I would argue it's better to have women working and the talent and the balanced perspective. And I have been grateful for my career, but I do think we have to appreciate where we've arrived in history, where everybody is so frustrated. There is not a man or a woman in our country that isn't exhausted and frustrated with the pace of change, with the pace of what's expected of them in their life. And that's a new thing that we're grappling with. Right. And there are so many things that are so much better. The progress has been enormous. If you look
Yes.
back on what it was when, our mothers were young,
Yeah.
enormous progress, enormous rapid growth in innovation because of all the access to people from all over the world now, where we can discover a cure for something and scale it up rapidly, right? And what we have to figure out, though, is what does that mean for quality of life, and how do we rebalance things so that we don't all feel stressed out and stretched too thin all the time. And so I don't know what that means. It might mean a 4-day work week. It might mean more family medical leave. Massachusetts has a great paid family medical leave act that we're very proud of. But we need to do more, and flexible work schedules. I mean, I work all the time at ungodly hours of the day, but sometimes I take breaks in the middle of the day because I have to. I'm working at 11 o'clock at night. I'm working on the weekends, but then I might go out for a walk in the middle of the day. And if I were in a traditional employer's location, would I be allowed to do that? But people need to do that for their health, and so these are the questions we're going to have to ask as we figure out why there's so much unhappiness in the country right now. And I believe we're up to the task. I think the human race is resilient, and these amazing changes, we will figure out how to conquer them instead of letting them conquer us.
Thank you so much for coming and talking to me.
My pleasure.
People got to see it. We'll have to check out the technology later, but whatever it is, it recorded, so it'll get out there.
Good.
And it's great to meet you. You're my rep, and I haven't actually met you in person, so I love this conversation. Yes, we both live in the same town, for God's sakes.
There you go.
All right.
Thanks so much. This has been a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks. Bye-bye.